So if we think about the drivers of migration, we can think about that in two elements. So the first element is why do people move? And clearly people move around the world because the opportunities available to them, the standard of living that they can have, the quality of life, their well-being, is different in some parts of the world compared to others. In fact, if you look at the large inequalities that exist in the world, the wonder is not that there is the amount of migration there is, but that there is so little migration. Inequalities in the world are very substantial, and one would expect people to try to move from places where there are no jobs to places where there are jobs, from places where there is violence and conflict to places where there is no violence or conflict. Indeed, from places where it is cold and there is 7 feet of snow in the winter to places where it is warm in the winter and you can live a comfortable life. And we see all of these kinds of migration in the world. We see people moving from Africa to Europe to get a better life. We see people moving from the Middle East to Europe to flee conflict. We see people moving from the Rust Belt of North America down to Florida or the states in the southwest of America, at least in part because it is warmer and sunnier in the winter. But the difficulty is separating all of these things out. So those inequalities exist, but then there are also proximate causes, things that actually trigger somebody to move. Why people move, putting that down to particular causes, and also trying to understand whether one cause is growing compared to another. The gist of our research is that if we take seriously the idea of migration being multicausal, so different things contribute to a decision to move or not to move all together, then saying that refugee migration is on the rise, or economic migration is on the rise, or indeed climate migration is on the rise, is a much more difficult thing to do, because all of those different causes are going to be present at any one point in time. So if I take the example of refugees compared to economic migrants, it looked in the summer of 2015, and I would certainly agree to this in a kind of in a loose way, it looked like the proportion of refugees, that the political causes of migration was on the rise and that the economic causes of migration were on the decline. But the reality is that the economic causes of migration never went away, and indeed the political causes of migration for any one individual had always to a certain extent been there. So we see an adjustment in some of the things that are a proximate cause of movement, but no real change in the fundamentals that are driving the migration system, which always was and remains fundamentally multicausal. If we apply that to the context of climate change, there is no question that climate change is happening, that some parts of the world are becoming more difficult to live in, and in a proximate way, that climate change related events like floods or hurricanes may be the trigger that force people to move. Although even then, actually the majority of those movements are over short distance, for short periods of time, with people returning, broadly speaking, to where they were living before that event happened. Over the long time frame, that is one of the elements of a mix that has always been important in terms of people deciding where they're going to live and whether that is going to lead to them moving or not. So I don't think that even over a decadal timescale, it is possible to say that there is an increase in climate change related migration. Climate change is one of the factors that influences a mix of drivers that influence the way that people make choices about where they're going to live. So I think it is correct to say that migration is an adaptation option, although I think that statement in itself is often misunderstood. So I would go a little bit further and say that migration, plenty of research evidence demonstrates that migration is an adaptation option for poor people in the face of all kinds of challenges, and indeed has been an option that people have used over centuries in response to extremes of various kinds. So that is not limited to extreme events. People also migrate in the face of severe health-related problems in their family. They migrate in the face of poverty. But that migration is often articulated not as a move of desperation, but as people taking control and trying to find a way to solve their difficult situations through their own efforts. Migration as adaptation is fundamentally about how households and individuals organise their lives in order to build income, build assets, and protect themselves against shocks. So there's no simple solution here, but my advice, based on the research that colleagues have been doing over at least 2 decades, is that we need to pay more attention to the livelihood strategies that households and poor households, poor families, poor individuals undertake themselves, and try to understand better the circumstances in which they work to build resilience, to build capacity to withstand shocks, and the circumstances in which they don't work.